So in this video, I wanted to let you know about a couple of resources that combine two great things: graphic novel reading and biblical languages. Before we do that, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, we would really appreciate it. We're trying to hit 20,000 subscribers by the end of this year, and we need your help to do it. So if you appreciate this ministry, if you enjoy these reviews or any of the other video content here on the channel, give us a subscribe, click the notifications icon, and like and share these videos. All that stuff really helps us, and it helps make Disciple Dojo more visible on YouTube so other people can find us as well. It's not just to boost my ego, I promise. Okay, now that housekeeping bit is out of the way, I want to tell you about these illustrated biblical books from our friends at Glossa House. So first of all, who is Glossa House? Well, a couple of weeks ago, I actually got to sit down with one of the heads of Glossa House, my friend Michael Halcomb, and we had a good discussion about Disciple Dojo and what this ministry is about. I'll put a link to that in the video description so you can check it out. But Michael is one of the people in charge of Glossa House, and glossa is the Greek word. It means tongue or language, and Glossa House is all about biblical languages. Everything they do is to help people better understand the biblical languages and to get into the text of Scripture. They have a number of resources, from technical grammars all the way to vocabulary guides. They have online courses. You can learn conversational Koine Greek. They're really doing a lot of work to get the biblical languages out there, outside of academia, to interested learners. Exactly the type of people who watch Disciple Dojo videos. So go check their stuff out. This is not a paid endorsement. Glossa House did give me copies of these resources. Now, I had already had the Exodus volume. Our friend Dr. Carmen Imes gave this to me when she was in town and we got together. And so I knew that these were great resources. So when I ran into the folks at Glossa House at their display at SBL, I saw all the other volumes they had. And as I was talking with Michael, I said, hey, I'd love to share these with Dojo viewers. Can I take a look at them and get a chance to review them? He said, absolutely. So he gave me the stack of all the ones that they've published so far and said, take them, take a look at them, and then just share your thoughts on the channel. And so that's what I want to do, starting with the volumes from the Pentateuch. So they have illustrated Genesis and illustrated Exodus. Now, when you open, these open because these are in Hebrew, so you read them this way, not this way. At the beginning, there's an introduction that tells you how to read on the page. So in the Hebrew volumes, you have to read right to left. Those of you that are manga fans, this would be pretty easy for you to pick up because it's the same way you read Japanese manga comics. Then there's a little introduction about how they've put the text together. And so they've taken the Hebrew accents out, but they've left the vowel marks in. And there's an explanation of that at the beginning. Then for each book, there's a chart of the different Kethiv and Koreh readings. And if you don't know Hebrew, don't worry about what that is. If you do know Hebrew, you know what that is. And then this is really helpful. At the beginning, there is a chart of Hebrew numbers because all the chapters are numbered with Hebrew numbering. And Hebrew doesn't have numbers, it uses combinations of letters. So this lays it out so that you can follow along on what chapter you're in as you're reading through. And then we come to the text. Now, this is Genesis, so these are the days of Genesis. And what they do is give you the actual Hebrew from the biblical text. There's no additions to this. There's no editorial glosses. This is the actual text of the Hebrew, but it's formatted in a graphic novel format. And at the bottom of each page, in very small print, is typically, depending on the translator who worked on the volume, a pretty woodenly literal translation. Because the goal of this translation at the bottom is to let you see what the text is actually saying, kind of word for word, rather than giving you a polished English translation, because this is for people who are trying to get better at reading Hebrew. So one of the things that helps you learn a language, as every person who's ever picked up a children's book can tell you, pictures help us solidify words. There's a reason that children's television is visually based. We don't hand a kid a grammar and say, here you go, knock yourself out, or a list of vocabulary words or a bunch of flashcards. No, we show pictures. We put something in its visual context. This is all basic learning, and it's how almost all languages, at least modern languages, are learned around the world today. So what Glossa House has tried to do is do that with the biblical text in its original language. And so even like, for instance, on these maps right here, the names of the different locations, the Hebrew names are given, so that when you see these Hebrew names as you're reading along in the text, you associate it with that place. Now, with any artistic depiction of scripture, there's always going to be artistic license. And as an artist myself, I know how excruciatingly hard it can be to illustrate something that's pretty mundane, which a lot of scripture is. Just discussions between people, or narration of events, or long sections of poetry. Some of them are harder to illustrate than others. And also, artistic license is going to play a part. So for instance, here's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. That is the absolute most Caucasian representation of Adam. I mean, Adam's literally blonde in this depiction. So that's pretty cringy. There he is reclining with a strategically placed plant growth. And so, this is typical of what you find in illustrated children's Bibles. I don't know the artist who did all of these. I don't know anything about their method. Looking at the pictures themselves, it seems like they probably used a lot of photo references, like people dressed up and then kind of rotoscoped over the outline, which is completely understandable if they did that. I don't know if they did or not, but just as an artist looking at this, that's what I imagine. Get people, dress them up in bathrobes, have them stand in the position that you want, snap a picture, and then kind of use that as your outline. But for the most part, they do capture kind of an ancient feel, although, it's a little bit Sunday school bathrobe-ish. The ancient Near East, probably not quite this colorful, but visually it captures your interest as you're reading the text. Now, some things in scripture are just hard to illustrate, just by nature of the genre. So for instance, in the Exodus volume by our friend Carmen Imes, Carmen provides the running translation along the bottom. The depiction of the signs and wonders over Egypt are pretty arresting. The parting of the Red Sea is done in dramatic fashion, the drowning of Pharaoh's chariot army, and then Israel arrives at Mount Sinai. Now, if you know anything about Exodus, it's at Mount Sinai where the narrative slows down for like a year. And most of it is Israel getting laws, regulations. So this is where the limitation of the genre shows itself. There are a number of these pages where they're really just laws. And rather than illustrating the individual laws, which would have been nice, honestly, but would have taken probably forever for the artist and would have made this volume about 5 or 6 times thicker than it actually is. You just come to these walls of text. And the nature of Exodus, that's what you get for most of the end of the book. But there are interspersed a couple of narrative incidents that happen later in Exodus. But in general, you get a lot of this big wall of Hebrew text. And then we come to some of the historical books. So Joshua and 1 Kings. And it's the same thing. Joshua's fairly action-packed, at least in the beginning, but then in the mid part of the book, it starts to slow down a bit when it talks about the conquest of the land. And so you're going to get a number of these city place names or the route that the conquest took, how the land was divided up. So there's not really a good way to graphically present lists of cities or battle campaigns. And so that's why Joshua is fairly thin, but 1 Kings has a lot more narrative. So you get depictions of the different episodes in Israel and Judah's history, the different kings. So it's a little bit more like a traditional graphic novel. And then we come to the writings. So they're grouped together. For instance, this one by Tim McNinch, who also did the Genesis translation, is Ruth, Esther, and Jonah. 3 very small books in the Hebrew Bible, and 3 that lend themselves well to the graphic format. So you've got Queen Esther getting all beautified. And I'm not going to lie, Esther's got it going on. And then we come to Jonah, probably the most easily adapted book in the Hebrew Bible if you were going to make a graphic novel. So you got Jonah getting thrown overboard. There comes the fish. And kudos to the artist. He didn't draw a whale. He drew a dag, a fish, because that's what the text says. And then you have the chapter where Jonah's in the belly of the fish reciting the psalm. And it's just the word bubble coming out of the fish with the psalm. And then Jonah gets thrown up onto dry land, and lo and behold, he kept his hat on the whole time. So that's a well-made hat that Jonah's wearing. Stayed on him throughout his ordeal in the belly of the fish. And then he preaches against Nineveh, and then he gets mad, and he goes, sits and pouts in his shelter. And he ends the book kind of angry at God. And then you have God asking Jonah the rhetorical question that ends the book of Jonah. I think this was my favorite of all the ones I looked at, the Ruth Esther Jonah volume. One, because these are fairly easy Hebrew. The Hebrew in some of these other ones is a little trickier, but these are basic Hebrew in terms of grammar. So they're probably the easiest to read along with. And I thought the illustrations were the most enjoyable in this volume. Then we come to Job. Job is interesting because if you've read the book of Job, after the opening section where you have Satan and he's kind of dressed like this little red goatee wearing bearded genie. I don't know if that's how I would picture the accuser, whoever his identity is, but he does look pretty devious. You see the calamities befall Job, and there's Job shaving his head. I don't know if that's exactly how you would shave your head, but it's a visually interesting image. And then you have him being afflicted with sores and scraping the pustules off of his arm with the piece of pottery, and the accuser coming before the throne of God, and God is never depicted. It's just this kind of source of light coming from the throne. But then once you get past that, most of Job is just a conversation between Job and his three friends. And so you get a lot of what we saw in Exodus, these kind of walls of text. And because of the graphic design layout, it's a little harder to preserve the poetry structure, the parallelism. Instead, it's just kind of formatted in these big chunks. And that's most of Job. And then at the end, Elihu speaks. He kind of appears out of nowhere, just like he does in the book of Job. And then that gets us ready for the appearance of God, for Yahweh to show up in the whirlwind and to start extolling the wonders of creation. And so you're ready for these cool images of Leviathan and Behemoth and all of these nature wonders that God describes to Job. And you don't get any of it. You just get Job sitting there making these long blocks of text again. And so God answers Job, but you never really see any of those. The most visually interesting passages in the book of Job, they don't get depicted. And it ends with Job's sacrifices. Now, one of the things that's great about the Job volume that is not in the other volumes is at the end, there are about a dozen pages of translation notes. This is for those of you that wonder, how do you get, let's say you know a little bit of Hebrew, but you're struggling through the text, because Job is a pretty hard book to read in terms of Hebrew poetry. It's just hard. And so you wonder, how did they get from that Hebrew to this English? And there are pages and pages of notes at the back where the translator, in this case, Dominic Hernandez, gave annotations and little grammatical, vocabulary, syntactical notes that go chapter by chapter. This was really helpful. That would be great to see in all of the volumes, because there are a lot of times, and any first-year Hebrew student or first-year Greek student can relate to this, there are a lot of times when you look at the original text and then you look at the translation and you just think, I don't see how you got from that to that. Because it may involve an idiom or a word play, or it may be a very obscure sense of a certain verbal root. There's all kinds of things like that that can make it hard. Translation is not just decoding something. Translation is as much of an art as it is a science. And so it's helpful when translators give us a little peek behind the curtain and let us know, hey, this is what we're thinking in this case. And then we come to what is arguably the latest book in the Hebrew Bible. I say arguably because depending on your view of authorship, you may agree or disagree, but we come to Daniel. Now, Daniel is another book where some of the chapters very much lend themselves to graphic presentation. A lot of the children's Bible stories we learn come from Daniel. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the fiery furnace, the lion's den. And these are classics in any illustrated Bible. But then the second half of the book of Daniel is not so easy to illustrate. And so once again, you get a lot of these blocks of text where Daniel's having these visions of things that are going to come, and interpreters, there are probably as many different interpretations of these visions as there are interpreters. But once again, you end up with just blocks of text instead of the actual content of those visions being graphically presented. Now also, there are certain sections of Daniel which are in Aramaic. If you don't know Hebrew, then you may miss it, but it's a different language, even though it uses the same letters. And in addition to being in Aramaic, Daniel is also one of the Old Testament books that Glossa House has done a Greek version too. So this is the Hebrew of Daniel. This is the Greek version of Daniel. And so the Greek version of Daniel is laid out exactly the same as the Hebrew version. It's just in left to right order. So you would read it like we read books in English. But all the imagery is the same. It's just the text in these word bubbles is in Greek, not Hebrew. And the translation of the text is not the same translation from the Hebrew text. This is done by Michael Halcomb and Andrew Keenan. And with the Greek volumes, in the beginning, there's an overview of the different formats that Daniel appears in, because the verse numbers in the Old Greek, in Theodotian or Theodotian, in the Latin Vulgate, and in the Masoretic text are different in all of those different versions. And so they lay them out for you here, and then it gives you the Glossa House, what this version goes with, how they've numbered the verses. There's also a page talking about the punctuation, because punctuation is not original to any Bible text. Punctuation is always added by editors. And then I'll mention this because it's pretty interesting. There's a note on the pronunciation of Koine Greek in the KEP, Koine Era pronunciation. Now, this is fairly distinct to Glossa House. Glossa House tends to use what they call the KEP pronunciation, as opposed to what most students of Greek learn in seminary, which is the Erasman pronunciation. So if you are listening to the resources by Glossa House and watching some of the videos that they have on their website, their Greek is going to sound different. They're going to pronounce delta, the letter D, as a the, like a TH in the word the. So it'll be delta. There's other letters that they pronounce differently as well. They pronounce both the Omicron and the Omega as O, whereas Erasman pronunciation and most seminarians say Omicron is pronounced ah, like in the word top, and Omega is pronounced O, like ocean. Now, this is a debate among Koine Greek teachers, and I am not competent to weigh in on it whatsoever. All I know is for 25 years, I've been using the Erasman pronunciation when I'm reading Greek or teaching or talking about a Greek word. And that's just what most people, at least in Western academia, are coming from. However, modern Greek, the language that's spoken in Greece, does not sound that way. So Glossa House is all about learning conversational use of the biblical languages. And so for that reason, and probably other reasons as well, they opt for using the Koine Era pronunciation, not the Erasman pronunciation. But that's also why some people will call it Logos Bible software, and some people will call it Logos Bible software. Now, technically, like our friend Mark Ward, who works for Logos, told us, they use both pronunciations. It'll just depend on the audience. But if you hear somebody say Logos, they've probably had some Greek in a Western academic setting. And if you hear them call it Logos, then they may have learned Greek, either modern Greek, or they learned it with Koine Era pronunciation. So that's just a little linguistic nerdiness for you. Maybe we'll have Michael on the podcast sometime to break it down for us, and we can really do a deep dive. But speaking of Greek, they also have New Testament volumes. So the Hebrew Old Testament volumes, they're all in this dark indigo purplish blue color. The Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament versions, are all in this green. And then the New Testament Greek are in red. And so the volumes they have available for the New Testament are Mark, John, and the book of Acts. And like the Hebrew, the Greek chapters are all given using Greek letters instead of numerals, but unfortunately they don't have a chart at the beginning of the Greek volumes that shows you what all of the numerals are. That would have been nice to see, because in seminary, a lot of times you just learning numbers kind of gets relegated to pick that up if you go further in the languages. And when you're first learning the languages, you don't learn the numbers just because they aren't that important in translating the biblical text. And most seminary Greek and Hebrew classes are geared towards getting students working in the text as quickly as possible. So things like learning how the numbers work, you just don't spend very much time on those. It would have been nice in the Greek volumes to have a corresponding chart like in the Hebrew volumes. So these are the illustrated Glossa House books of the Bible. They will probably add more as they go. And I think they even have some other works, like maybe some of the church fathers or the apostolic fathers, and maybe some early Latin texts as well. I'm not sure. Glossa House is always putting out stuff, so you would have to check their website for what's available. But these are the ones that I was able to get copies of at SBL and take a look at. So I wanted to share them with you, Dojo viewers. If you are studying the languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, these are a great resource to have. As you know, if you've tried learning the languages, it's hard to sometimes root visually the words or the vocabulary or the verbs, especially with some image that kind of makes it stick into our minds. So the concept of what they're trying to do is very, very good. I'm all about it. I think it's a great idea. Anything that helps people better familiarize themselves with the biblical languages, we're all for it. So I do recommend these resources. If I had to critique them, my critiques would be in some of those passages that are more drawn out. You can get a little bogged down in those big walls of text. Some of them, like city names or itineraries, you can understand them not illustrating those. But I think if there were maybe a bigger team of illustrators, or if they had different artists, maybe a different artist for each volume, because the art in all of these is pretty homogeneous. It's done by, it looks like the same artist. Again, I don't know anything about these. This art could be taken from another publication that they have the rights to. I don't know anything about that, but it might be cool to see different artists and different takes on some of these biblical stories and get more of the texts illustrated. Like those later sections in Job, you got to have somebody drawing Leviathan and Behemoth, or at least taking a stab at it. Like Revelation, you're never going to be able to visually do justice to what is being described in the text, but it would be fun to see somebody take a stab at it. Regardless, though, that's a minor critique. I love what Glossa House is doing, and I think these are great. If you're taking a course on the Gospel of Mark in seminary, get the volume on Mark and have this as you study along. Let it kind of visually resonate with you and providing something of a visual reference as you're reading through the text. So I will link Glossa House's website in the video description below. After you watch this video, go over there, show them some love. You can follow them here on YouTube as well. They have a YouTube channel. They've been friends of Disciple Dojo for a while, so we want to show them some love as well. So go check them out. And of all the books of the Bible, if you could illustrate any one of them, or if you could hire an artist to illustrate any one of them, which book would you choose and why? Leave that in the comment section below and we can have a little discussion. Okay, that's all for this review. Thanks for watching. Thanks to Glossa House for letting me take a look at these volumes. I've really enjoyed thumbing through them, and they've actually helped me keep my Hebrew sharp. My Greek is still, but maybe these will help me sharpen it as well. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you back here next time at Disciple Dojo.